The murder of Mary Kelly took place on Friday the 9th of November 1888 in her room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street in Spitalfields. Her body was discovered at 10:45 in the morning by Thomas Bowyer, who had been sent by her landlord John McCarthy to collect her overdue rent of 29 shillings. Almost immediately upon the body being discovered, McCarthy sent Bowyer to fetch the police, and Inspectors Walter Beck and Walter Dew were at the scene by 11:15. Over the next hour or so, they were followed by other officers, including Frederick Aberline, although the police didn't actually enter the room for several hours, as they were awaiting the arrival of bloodhounds to be put upon the scent of the killer. When it became known that no bloodhounds would be coming, Superintendent Thomas Arnold gave instructions for the door to be forced open, and at 1:30 p.m. the police went into the tiny room to begin the grim task of viewing the crime scene. At some stage that afternoon, the photograph of Mary Kelly's body lying on the bed was taken, and this truly conveys the horror of the sight that confronted the police that day. Throughout the afternoon, detectives and doctors examined the room and the body, and it wasn't until 4 o'clock that the remains of Mary Kelly were removed from the premises. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph described what happened in its edition of Saturday the 10th of November. Precisely at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the body was removed from Dorset Street to Shoreditch mortuary, which stands at the back of Shoreditch Church. The mutilated remains were placed in a coarse coffin, which had apparently been used on many previous occasions for the conveyance of the dead, and which was partially covered with a coarse canvas cloth. The straps of the coffin were sealed. The coffin was conveyed in a one-horse ordinary furniture van and was escorted by several constables under Sergeant Bentham. A large mob followed the van to the mortuary, where a crowd was waiting to see the coffin transferred to the building. The photographer, who had been called to photograph the room and the body, removed his camera from the premises at 4:30, and shortly afterwards a detective officer carried from the house a pail with which he left in a four-wheel cab. The pail was covered with a newspaper and was stated to contain portions of the woman's body. It was taken to the house of Mr. Phillips, 2 Spittal Square. The windows of the room where the crime was committed were boarded up and a padlock put on the door. The streets were patrolled by the police all the evening, and no one was allowed to loiter near the place. All the neighbourhood last night was like a fair, and the excitement and hubbub filled the streets with thousands of idlers, attracted by the morbid curiosity so common among the London lower classes. The inquest into Mary Kelly's death was held here at Shoreditch Town Hall on Monday the 12th of November, with Dr. Roderick MacDonald, the coroner for the North East District of Middlesex, presiding. MacDonald was in no mood for a long and drawn-out inquest, and, unlike the inquests into the deaths of the previous victims, Mary Kelly's was held in one sitting, and having heard evidence from various witnesses, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown later that day. This meant that the funeral could then be organised. There was initially some confusion in the newspapers as to when the funeral would actually take place. As the Nottingham Journal reported on Thursday the 15th of November, the funeral of the murdered woman will not take place until after the arrival from Wales of some of her relatives and friends who were expecting to reach London last evening. It appears, however, that no relatives of Mary Kelly had in fact been traced and had therefore not made the journey to London, so the next day the newspapers announced that her funeral would take place on the following Monday. Mr. Henry Wilton, who had been the sexton of St. Leonard's Church for 50 years, had, according to several newspapers, agreed to incur the total cost of the funeral himself as a mark of sincere sympathy with the poor people of the neighbourhood in whose welfare he is deeply interested. He lived here at the Clerk's House, a building which still stands next to St. Leonard's Church. On the evening before the funeral took place, Mr. Wilton received a bizarre visit, which was reported by several newspapers over the course of the next few days. On Sunday evening, a venerable lady called upon Mr. Wilton and said that she wanted a lock of Mary Kelly's hair, and that she was willing to pay anything for it. Mr. Wilton replied that that was impossible, and continued obdurate in spite of his visitor's entreaties. The lady explained her mission at some length. She was acquainted, she remarked, with a female spiritualist who has been blind since she was 3 years of age. The sightless spiritualist was a strong medium, and could she but have a lock of the deceased's hair, the lady felt sure that the murderer's accurate description would be revealed. The singular request, it needs scarcely be added, was not complied with, and the aged lady expressed her sorrow at the result of her visit. The following morning, Monday the 19th of November, a considerable crowd had assembled outside Shoreditch Church by 10:30, and over the next few hours the crowd steadily increased until it was several thousand strong. A large body of police officers under Sergeant Carter were in attendance to keep the crowd at bay. Mary Kelly's body lay in the mortuary, which was located on the site now occupied by this colourful structure, which stands in the grounds of St. Leonard's Church. According to the Hackney and Kingsland Gazette, the general impression was that the body would have been brought out at the back entrance of the mortuary. All the adjoining streets, lanes, and alleys became thronged for about an hour before the time of the funeral. At noon, the bell of the church began tolling, and, according to the Birmingham Suburban Times, the signal appeared to draw all the residents in the neighbourhood together. Shortly before 12:30, the body, enclosed in a polished elm and oak coffin with metal mounts, was carried from the mortuary, borne on the shoulders of 4 men, and taken to an open car that was standing by the church gate. On the coffin plate were engraved the words, "Marie Jeanette Kelly, died 9th of November, 1888, aged 25 years. Upon the coffin were 2 crowns of artificial flowers and a cross made up of heartsease. Attached to it was a large card bearing the words, "A last tribute of respect to Mary Kelly. May she rest in peace, and may her murderer be brought to justice." There was an enormous preponderance of women in the crowd, the Birmingham Suburban Times continued, and scarcely any had any coverings to their heads. As the coffin appeared, the crowd became greatly affected. Round the open car in which it was to be placed, men and women struggled desperately to get to touch the coffin. Women with faces streaming with tears cried out, "God forgive her," and every man's head was bared in token of sympathy. The sight was quite remarkable, and the emotion natural and unconstrained. 2 mourning coaches followed, one containing 3 and the other 5 persons, mourners who had been fortifying themselves for the journey at a public house close to the church gate. Joe Barnett was amongst them, with someone from McCarthy's, the landlord, and the others were women who had given evidence at the inquest. After a tremendous struggle, the car with the coffin fully exposed to view set out at a very slow pace, all the crowd appearing to move off simultaneously in attendance. The traffic was blocked, and the constables had great difficulty in obtaining free passage for the small procession through the mass of carts, vans, and tramcars. The Walthamstow and Leighton Guardian reported on the cortege's journey in the following Saturday's edition. All along the route, signs of sympathy were to be seen on every hand, and it was a very touching sight to witness many poor women of the class to which the deceased belonged greatly affected. The distance from Shoreditch Church to the cemetery at Leytonstone by road is about 6 miles, and the route traversed was Hackney Road, Cambridge Heath, Whitechapel Road, and Stratford. In the Whitechapel Road, the crowds on each side of the roadway were very great, and there was a considerable amount of emotion manifested. The appearance of the roadway throughout the whole journey was remarkable, owing to the hundreds of men and women who escorted the coffin on each side, and who had to keep up a sharp trot in many places. But the crowd rapidly thinned away when getting into the suburbs. The car and coaches broke into a trot, and the cemetery was reached at 2 o'clock. The Reverend Father Columban, with 2 acolytes and a cross-bearer, met the body at the door of the little chapel of St. Patrick's, and the coffin was carried at once to a grave in the northeastern corner. Barnet and the poor women who had accompanied the funeral knelt on the cold clay by the side of the grave while the service was read by Father Columban. The coffin was incensed, lowered, and then sprinkled with holy water, and the simple ceremony ended. The floral ornaments were afterwards raised to be placed upon the grave, and the filling up was completed in a few moments and was watched by a small crowd of people. There was a very large concourse of people outside the gates who were refused admission until after the funeral was over. And so Mary Kelly was laid to rest at St. Patrick's Cemetery, where, over the years, the site of her grave was reused for further burials, with the result that the exact resting place of her remains is now uncertain. In 1986, a man named John Morrison erected a large white headstone in her memory, but placed it over the wrong burial spot. In 1988, the cemetery superintendent marked the approximate site of her grave with a Celtic cross. Sadly, this was vandalized within a few hours, and the Celtic cross was subsequently removed. However, in the 1990s, a simple memorial was placed over the approximate site of her grave, and this is now visited by people from all over the world who leave flowers and trinkets to her memory. It bears the poignant inscription, "In loving memory of Marie Jeanette Kelly. None but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever." In recent years, there have been several reports that her body was going to be exhumed. The first to suggest doing so was Dr. Wynne Weston Davies, a former surgeon who in his book, The Real Mary Kelly, suggested that her true identity was Elizabeth Weston Davies and that she had been his great-aunt. Dr. Weston Davies was quoted in several newspapers as saying that the only way of absolutely proving that the Ripper's final victim was my great-aunt is to exhume Mary Kelly's body. We will then attempt to extract DNA from her bones or teeth and compare them with DNA from myself or my brother, who, as far as I know, are her only living relatives. Despite newspaper reports that he had received permission from the Ministry of Justice to carry out an exhumation, it transpired that they had only said that they would consider the request, and his intention to exhume the remains ultimately came to nothing. Then, in 2017, the newspapers again became excited by the news that renowned crime author Patricia Cornwell had commissioned members of the University of Leicester team who had discovered and identified the remains of King Richard III to look into the feasibility of identifying Mary Kelly's final resting place with a view to exhuming her remains. The team had visited the cemetery on the 3rd of May 2016 and had examined the area where Mary is thought to be buried. They concluded that her grave had probably been dug through when the area was reused in the 1940s, and given the fact that searching for her would involve disturbing the occupants of potentially hundreds of other graves, and the next of kin would have to give their permission in each case, it simply wouldn't be at all feasible to find and exhume Mary Kelly's remains. As Dr. Turi King, the leader of the project, put it, most human remains found during excavations remain stubbornly and forever anonymous, and this must also be the fate of Mary Jane Kelly. And so Mary Kelly remains as elusive and enigmatic in death as she was in life. Personally, I cannot see that exhuming her remains would serve any useful purpose other than to satisfy morbid curiosity. Wherever she lies, may she rest in peace, and may people continue to visit the approximate site of her grave and at least keep her memory alive.